do you think you are? How do you describe yourself?
Who do I think I am? Do you know, it's become increasingly hard to explain what I do, but in the best possible way, because I think that for a long time I probably focused on narrower definitions of my role and my profession in life, while simultaneously feeling kind of constrained by those definitions. Okay. I think for a long time I probably said I'm a psychologist and academic. In fact, I'm sure I said that because it trips off the tongue quite naturally.
People can understand it.
Yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely. It's like almost like the little kids version of like the jobs that adults have. Yes. You know, these instantly recognizable kinds of job roles. And so I was an academic by day and a psychologist by night, essentially, in that I would have my academic post during the working day and then literally run to my practice a few streets away and see clients in the evening. Mm-hmm. And because I was an academic who was training other people to become psychologists and I was practicing psychology myself, there was a unity and a coherence to that, and it felt quite well integrated. Yes. And I was practicing what I preached, literally.
I'm interested, slightly tangent. What did you enjoy more, the practicing or the teaching?
It was practicing and teaching were so different from one another. I mean, yes, I use my practice to inform my teaching, but as I climbed the ladder in academia, it became much more about being a glorified administrator, and a lot of managerial stuff started coming into it. Okay. And although there were things that I enjoyed about that, I felt like it wasn't really what I signed up to do. I think that when I was in the classroom teaching postgraduate students to do the things that I do, be aware of the things that I'm aware of in practice, I really, really enjoyed that part of it. That's essentially what I got into academia to do. But as time went on, I felt like I was permitted to do less and less of it because of all the other things that were required of me.
Yeah, okay. So go on, so you had these two jobs.
Yeah.
What happened? Was it like a moment?
Well, I think there were many moments leading up to my making a shift away from academia, but I think that essentially I had a sort of crushing realization at some point that all the way along, and before I got into psychology and before I got into academia, I'm fundamentally a creative person. Right. And I had assumed that there would be a lot more scope for creativity and creative endeavors within my academic role. I somehow imagined that would be more part of the job in terms of writing and speaking and getting my knowledge out to a wider public. And being able to write creatively and flexibly about the things that I was interested in. I sort of assumed that time would be afforded me as part of my role as an academic. And I assumed that the higher I climbed, the more time would be given to me for those sorts of things. And that might have used to be the case once upon a time in academic contexts, but I don't feel that that's so much the case anymore, at least not in UK academia, at least not where I was working. And I started to recognize the fact that not being creative and not engaging in creative endeavors was almost literally suffocating me. Like I was the sort of person who needed that in order to be able to be happy and to function well and to be content. And that I couldn't keep looking to other people to make and protect and offer me that time. I had to seize it for myself. I had to create it.
So one of the things I find fascinating about that is what you're describing for me in terms of you're this academic who at the early stages maybe your creativity was fueled, but as you got higher up the ladder, you were stifled by being a manager and administrator and doing. To me, that's exactly what happens in business as well, whereby you start in a role which you're loving, which you're great at, but the next stage is to progress up the ladder. And as you progress up the ladder, you're doing less of what you're really good at and more at looking after everyone else. And almost the role of administration or management or whatever is massively undervalued by the fact that society perceives that actually that's the steps that you have to take in order to be, as you get more experience, that's where you go. Well, actually it's a completely different skill set to what you were good at, which was kind of your academic work and kind of being creative and everything around that.
Yeah, I think I was relatively happy as a senior lecturer, lower down the ladder, and I had time, but I also had a headspace because I didn't have a weight of responsibility or expectation, and I could kind of just do what I loved about the academic context while still having time to pursue some of my own stuff. And that just didn't, I think that universities have become so corporate and administrative and managerial in their nature, and they're run like corporations increasingly, so it's no surprise that it's not that different than other sectors in business.
How conscious do you think you were then of the fact that of your dual personality of being the academic and being the practical person, because that was almost, you had that backup in the other career?
Yeah.
Do you think you were doing that purposely, or it just happened that way?
Yeah, because I think I always enjoy the kind of diversity of experiences and activities in my working week in any case. I think it was always going to be difficult for me to do a kind of 9 to 5 where I essentially fulfilled the same sorts of functions every day. So I enjoyed the variety that there was in flipping back and forth. But I think that that created a bit of, sort of sucked some time away from the more explicitly, nakedly creative kinds of endeavors where I could be kind of quite spontaneous and unstructured. So there was the variety, but it was all quite structured and constraining in that way. And I think there was another thing where I worked in a psychology department and then I was a psychologist in my practice. And so people thought, well, you're a psychologist. Everything you do is related to that. You know, we're not expecting you to do something over here or over there. And so I kind of felt like I funneled myself into everything that I do has to be hooked on to a particular kind of subject.
Yes.
But I always enjoyed the multidisciplinary conferences the most. I always thought of things in a very multi-stranded, interdisciplinary kind of way. And I felt like that was sort of discouraged because people would say, well, how does this relate to your job here at the university? How does this benefit the psychology department specifically? And so I think increasingly I chafed under that.
Do you think it's changed now? Because there's a lot of talk about multidisciplinary working practices, et cetera, et cetera. Do you think that's changed, or do you think that's still out there as a problem for people who want to do all sorts of different things, but actually are being driven down a funnel approach of where they're going with their careers?
You see the rise of things like co-working spaces and talking about the gig economy and people working more flexibly and doing multi-hyphenate careers and things like that. So that's one strand. And in other areas, I think you almost see a kind of backlash against that. There was a story in the news recently about a bank sort of saying no more working from home, you know, you have to be here from 9 to 5. And a lot of, you know, kind of people saying, well, what's going on with that? Everything's changing. Remote working is possible. Remote meetings are, why are we doing this to people essentially? Why are we still expecting this of them? So I think it depends a little bit on your industry, but you know, I know that for me, it was only when I got out from underneath those strictures and started working at a co-working space and just basically working and living a more creative life where I could write my own ticket during the week that I started to get a feeling like, okay, now I know how to do it. Now I know how to be me professionally in a way that makes me happy.
And so tell me through, so you just left academia and you went off and did your own thing, kind of still obviously being the counselling psychologist. What were you looking to achieve? Where was your head at in terms of what you're hoping to do with this newfound or return to creativity?
You know, I went to a literary festival. I went to Hay, actually, festival a couple of years ago, and I saw the people up on stage talking about their stuff. I'd never been before. So I saw the discussions on stage, I saw the talks, I was in the festival bookshop looking through books, and I was thinking, I've been studying this fascinating subject from an academic perspective of death and the digital for over a decade. I'm used to speaking as an academic. I thought there's literally no reason I can think of why this shouldn't be me, why I shouldn't be doing more of this. And so I went straight back to work, and I had to delve into the very depths of the HR website to find any reference to sabbaticals or unpaid leave or whatever. But I found it after a phone call to HR, and I saw that you could take a year unpaid if you had been there for a certain amount of time. And I wrote that letter that day, and it was like a resignation letter, but it was a soft exit because I was terrified.
Hedging bets.
I was terrified, and it wasn't for financial reasons. It wasn't, you just get the idea that this is who I am, this is what I'm supposed to do, and to just jump out of that.
As an academic, do you feel you were you're almost selling out by going and speaking to the public?
Yes.
Had you done it before? You hadn't really done it before?
I mean, I'd spoken to the public before. I'd spoken to primarily other academics and practitioners, but I had done some media work or speaking to the public before, yes, but much less of it than what I wanted. Even though I was committed to the notion of being a public intellectual, somebody who takes their knowledge and wisdom outside the kind of ivory tower, academics, and wants to. I've always really encouraged my students to do that. I've trained them in how to think beyond just disseminating knowledge to academics and other professionals. So I was committed to that without having had the time to do very much of it. So this is one of the things that I wanted to move towards, but I felt judged for it, and I wasn't always wrong. It wasn't just my paranoia. There was some really explicit feedback that, oh, well, if you're going to write a nonfiction book for the general public, for example, we don't really care about that, or that doesn't really count. Like, you can do that on your own time. So there are various and subtle ways in which that's almost sort of, it's less than somehow.
And then the flip side is death and digital. Obviously, digital is huge. Death is something we try and avoid talking about because it's death. Did you feel that the time was right for the general public to start educating themselves? Was there a moment that you looked out there and was like, yes, they're ready now? Or are we still not ready, but we need to know?
I think there was a juxtaposition of my readiness to start talking about it to different audiences in different ways, and a perception of the public readiness for it. Because a couple of different things were happening. There were various kind of disruptions to people's trust in, kind of certain big tech companies. There were some scandals happening. There was a feeling of maybe a bit of sort of digital backlash or kind of questioning about the extent of power that we were giving over to big techs and other corporations that control and process our data. So I thought, one of the things that we haven't thought very much at all about, and that what happens to our data when we die, nobody really talks about that very much. They all encourage us to log all of this data and invest all of our data with various corporations. But it was far from clear what would then happen to all of this information when we are no longer here, and it wasn't being considered by the companies themselves to the extent that it needed to be, much less the public. So I felt like I could see a critical juncture approaching where enough people would start to die off just because the passage of time, since all of this started happening, where it was going to become a big problem. And if we don't raise the awareness and get systems and understandings in place sooner rather than later, it's going to be a crisis further down the line. So I felt like now was an important moment, yes. And
did you find in your practical work as a psychologist that actually you were talking about it to some of your clients anyway, and therefore you almost, I wouldn't say you were using them as a test ground, but you were using them as a test ground as to the reactions you were getting and what the conversations you were going to have were, and were they more as we are getting, as a society, getting more open in terms of kind of what our mental states and what we're thinking about and everything like that they were more open to you, to the conversation, than maybe previously you would have had?
Well, what I would notice about my clinical work, and I don't deal with bereavement or death specifically, no more than any other practitioner would, but what I did notice is that every time there was a bereavement in one of my clients, every time there was a marital sort of issue or relationship kind of breakdown, every time there was a problem with couples, every time, it often had to do with data, with information that had been, and privacy, kind of breaches of trust or boundaries, or somebody seeing something online, on their partner's device, or accessing something that did something that, kind of psychologically significant, not being able to access something from somebody who'd passed away. So it was becoming more and more of a theme. Who has control of access to various, kind of bodies of data. And I was hearing stories from people trying to liaise with big tech companies to get access to their loved ones' data. and really having big struggles with that mirrored the struggles I was reading about increasingly in the mass media. But it kind of felt like here's all these little pockets and nobody's really talking about it in a joined up kind of way. So that's what I really wanted to do.
And did you go in there with an end goal, or is it very much just to open the conversation?
Well, since I've been thinking about this for so long, so 10, 11, 12 years, something like that, and writing about it for so long, it kind of felt like my goal was to think about it, and this relates to my kind of exit from a psychology department in academia, or kind of my mixing it up more. I didn't want to look at this through exclusively a psychological lens, and nor did I want to look at it exclusively from a practical, like digital estate planning lens. I mean, that's other people's, people have done that. I wanted to look at it from all sorts of different angles. I wanted to really be able to bring the threads all together in as coherent a way as possible in what is actually a hideously confusing, sort of snarled mess that we're still very much trying to figure it out. So I wanted to use all of my experience and all these multiple vantage points to try to produce something as clear-eyed as possible that people could then use as a platform to say, right, now we understand far much more about what we need to do about this. And I mean individuals, and I also mean corporations. I also mean big tech. So I wanted to produce that.
And who do you think is going to wise up first, the big tech or the individuals?
Big tech has very little incentive to wise up in many ways. You know, you've probably been aware of the rise of digital ethicists, and digital ethics is this area. Digital ethics is really interesting because at this point I feel like it's really pie in the sky, because everything that the digital ethicists are drawing attention to about what's wrong with our current systems and the problems that this, the human rights issues and kind of moral issues that there are happening now. All of that's correct, but corporations' commercial interests and incentives are often, if not always, in conflict with the ethics being referred to. And who's the big dog that's going to enforce all of that? Because unless we get law and regulation in place to say to the corporations, look, this is what you can do, this is what you can't, these are the powers you can have, these are what you're not allowed to do, then there's going to be an issue, because some of the things that need to be done with respect to death in the digital, big tech can talk a good game, and some big tech does talk a good game, but at the end of the day, if it interferes with their commercial interests, they won't implement. So, and the problem is that because it's so complex, and because it's kind of a bit of a snarled mess dealing with laws and concepts that came into play in a pre-digital era, a lot of lawmakers and regulators don't know what to do with it. I have a lot of compassion for the human faces behind faceless regulation, because GDPR, for example, 2018 General Data Protection Regulation, doesn't deal with the data of the deceased at all. It shuffles it off to member states. And that's understandable, because data protection hasn't historically dealt with the deceased. It deals with human rights, and the dead aren't perceived to be human, so GDPR says, well, this isn't for us. Let the member states figure out what to do with it. The problem is, the data that we're leaving behind digitally is not just personal, it's hyper-personal. It's more like digital identities than it is just digital sort of data. And there's all sorts of issues that make me really wish that GDPR had gone there. There needs to be a wholesale rethink about the privacy of the dead.
So and let me ask you something. From my perspective, every time we talk, kind of, you are coming from digital and the dead, that's the death, that's your... But actually what you're talking about is far broader.
Oh, it's massive.
And every time I've spoken to you, my head starts whirling about all this other, the impact that everything has. Where do you feel your remit or kind of begins and ends? And actually what kind of... I think it fascinates me in terms of what are you trying to get me as a consumer, as a general public, engaged in and trying to do? And at what point do I get scared and just be like, it's too big an issue, and kind of this is something that actually people far cleverer, far brighter, far more intelligent than me have to deal with, because I'm just out there, I'm just using Facebook or Google or whatever it was in order to just live my life.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of where my remit begins and ends, I think that with regard to corporations, business, big tech, whatever, I think that I'm trying to convey to them that it's not just about kind of collecting data willy-nilly everywhere without having some sort of framework in place and some sort of policies and procedures in place for what happens to that data when. Because it's not just legacy websites or people that specifically set out to kind of capture and retain sort of data after somebody's gone that this is relevant for. It's pretty much any company who collects and stores personally identifiable or sensitive personal information in their systems. If they don't have a concept in place for what can and should happen to that data when users, clients, whoever's associated with that data passes away, that's something that they need to have. It's relevant to any company. And even if they're not seeing a critical mass of issues arising now, in time they will, because the thing that you can guarantee is that given enough time, 100% of all those people associated with that data
are going to pass away. So therefore, are you too far ahead of the game? Because you are ahead of the game, but are you too far? Because actually it's only really going to be impactful once actually the kind of a generation are passing, so mass population. You said you've heard individual stories.
Yes, it might not be impactful from a commercial perspective now to the extent that it will be in the future. But then from a psychologist angle, I'm thinking, well, even if one family or two families or three families or 10, 20, 100 are kind of affected by this, then that's already, an indication that something needs to be done now, because it's only a foretaste, a tip of the iceberg of the coming issue. So rather than treating it as, oh, this is a one-off, this is a two-off, this is a three-off kind of thing, this should be a clarion call, sort of saying, okay, these people have died this year. This is a test case for what's going to happen. We're clearly not prepared. We don't have the things in place. What are we considering about how much data needs to be collected? We're sitting in, devices are collecting just silently, whirring around in the background, more and more and more data. And from a marketing perspective, or like for example, Alexa and sort of all the devices kind of listing away in our houses, sort of tapping into that kind of market that Amazon and Google and everything are so keen to sort of tap into. They're looking to collect as much information as possible to further the bottom lines of their company, and that's what's going on. But there's massive, kind of huge issues to do with what happens to that data when the people associated with them pass it, what kind of problems there can be, not just for the companies, but...
So how do you feel the legislators, the politicians, where are they in there?
They're not engaging.
Because
it's so hideously confusing. Because they're dealing with laws and regulations and concepts that came into place in a pre-digital era. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to get their heads around what is the case now in this bolt-on kind of way. They're like, okay, here's existing data privacy law, data protection law. Here's existing intellectual property or copyright law. Here's the existing laws of succession. The bases for these current laws have been in place for decades and decades, or even hundreds of years in some cases. And with respect to laws of succession, they're different, like in all sorts of different countries and states, they vary. Now, people are thinking, oh, well, how do we need to think about this and like alter this to make it fit digital stuff? In a way, I think it needs to be stripped back and sort of saying, okay, pre-digital era laws just don't work for this sort of space at all.
But therefore, we almost say kind of, and we hear it the whole time, like the digital revolution. And ultimately, if this is a revolution, actually, do we need to start again? Are we saying that law, kind of the politicians and law, and it's not up to speed, and actually there's no point trying to fit the whole thing.
Absolutely.
And actually you're advocating revolution rather than not evolution.
Yes, absolutely. Law historically is very sluggish. They're like, oh, well, let's wait for a case to test these principles, and then we'll, and then based on what happens on that decision in this case, all that kind of stuff.
But then who leads that? If you're saying the corporations aren't going to go kind of because it's not in their interest, which I understand, you're saying politicians can't do it because they're going to evolve, because they need to look after themselves and they can't get to grips with the whole thing.
Absolutely. This is why I'm saying that GDPR 2018 missed a trick. Right. This is why I'm saying when the Law Commission put out a consultation, I think a year ago, to reform will, kind of all they were dealing was like, can you make an electronic will like without having to have an ink signature? But they said, oh, but we're not dealing with digital assets. We're not dealing with, oh, that's for some future consultation. And my colleagues and I were like, no, it needs to be now. So they're kind of like putting it off because they're just thinking, oh, I don't, that's not going to be relevant. This is something for later. So my message is, it isn't something for later. It's something for now. It needs to be engaged with sooner rather than later. If there's things that you're not understanding about where we are with this, what I write, what I speak about is designed to help you understand why it needs to be now.
Okay, and I think that was my next question. Are you basically saying kind of what my role is to educate people so actually they have knowledge?
Yes.
What we do as a collective with that knowledge, you don't necessarily know.
Well, I think I probably have general principles that I think can guide people. I am saying mobilize, but here's things that you need to consider in terms of mobilizing in a particular direction. Yeah. Who are the stakeholders? What are the moral and ethical dimensions? What are the psychological dimensions? What are the sociological dimensions? How do we square all of those with the real commercial interests and imperatives? The irony is that if people would strip it back and think about it from first principles, it might result in something that is far better for the bottom line.
I think that's my question is kind of, you had Google who kind of when they started it was be less evil and kind of everything like that. Do you think there's a case for a company who could take over the market, who basically were living and breathing by the ethics of being less evil and actually being more open to consumers and actually making them understand? Do you think the market could exist, actually they could be that powerful enough to disrupt, for want of a better word?
Well, it's possible. At the moment, Tim Berners-Lee is talking about something called solid, sort of saying, well, why do we have to, why can't we have a kind of a web presence that's more kind of apart from all of these companies, engaging with Facebook or engaging with Google or whatever it is, is there a different way, of operating, with more autonomy and control as individuals rather than sort of selling our souls, over to, trying to kind of think, did the internet kind of go he's kind of thinking maybe the internet didn't sort of go in the direction that I hoped it, that I wanted to go. Let's, kind of my big plan. And so I think there may be but I think that ultimately it is about that. It's sort of thinking, okay, as individuals, we are losing more control, autonomy, free will, choice, our attention, kind of bandwidth all the time. James Williams he wrote a fantastic book called Stand Out of Our Light. It's about, kind of the attention economy and maintaining freedom in the face of all of these really subtle behavioral things whirring underneath the surface that are basically harvesting our attention and our free will wholesale, and I think that part of what I'm talking about with the death and the digital thing and the data of the deceased and of our loved ones is taking back control over our memories, taking back control over our information, not just for our lifetimes, but for what can happen to it and how it may be transferred and used in the future. Not just about remembering us, but how it can be of benefit to future generations without being locked behind some sort of password and data mined to improve some big tech company's algorithms.
So I suppose my last question kind of off the back of that is, do you feel positive this is going to happen? Are you feeling positive about the whole thing? Or do you think we as a society, as a kind of, whether it's business or personal, need to step up now?
I think we need to step up now. I think that people talk about there being a digital backlash, but we're kind of poised on the cusp of, it feels like sort of our last chance to sort of say, okay, before our free will is completely surrendered, before we are so in the laps of these companies that there's nothing more that we can do, there needs to be a much kind of greater push now to kind of fight back against these incursions into our autonomy as individuals, into our freedom as a society. And I think that my work on what happens to your data after you die is another way of casting a light on that, to sort of casting into sharper relief just how little freedom, ownership, control we are coming to have. And I think that that's what the book really, that I've written recently and what I talk about really emphasizes. So although the headline is that I'm a specialist and expert in death and the digital, at the end of the day, it's much more of a lens on what is happening to our freedoms.
Brilliant. Elaine, thank you so much indeed for your time. It's been a pleasure, as always, speaking to you.
Yes, likewise.
I look forward to plenty more conversations.
Yeah, fantastic. I look forward to it too. Thank you.
Okay.